If you look at Berg's early songs, and they were published in the 1980s, Jugendlieder, they're in 2 volumes. And they were specifically many settings that Berg wrote as a young man, not wanting them to be published at all, thank you very much. But by the 1980s, Helene Berg, who was the widow at the gateway, had died. And of course, the scholars got their hand on all these songs, and they showed an incredible, huge and wonderful choice of poetry. Very little pianistic sophistication, quite simple ditties. It's how he began as a song composer. Now, the Sieben frühe Lieder are not really that early, which is to say, what he seems to have done in the 1920s, when he was already in his 40s, was to go back to his archives and discover a whole set of songs and pretty them up. So, in a sense, there's nothing in this extraordinary piano writing in the set that you find in those volumes of early songs. It's a result of his studies with Schoenberg, who was his mentor and his the person who guided him. So to say that they are songs of youth is to say that the initial inspiration for setting the songs came from youth. And I think what the composer did was took early versions and he elaborated, he corrected, he filled in to say, yeah, well, you know, I love this and this can go a bit better and this can be a bit more interesting. It's a bit like Schubert sometimes going back to old manuscripts and doing them. And there's one particular cycle by Benjamin Britten, which is sung and blocked by baritones, called Tit for Tat, where he went back in the 1970s to pieces he'd written in the 1930s and didn't rewrite them, but sort of dressed them up a little bit better for public consumption. And this is what is happening. It's pretty clear that Die Nacht, right from the very beginning, was an inspiration from Debussy. Mm-hmm. Indeed, it's very, very interesting to see, isn't it, that a Viennese composer had enough of a background and money and well-to-do parents with book-lined shelves and money to go to concerts. I mean, the Bergs had a house in the Tuchlauben, which, if you know anything about the Innere Stadt of Vienna, is very posh.
Mm-hmm. I was just there.
Yeah. There were financial difficulties later for the family and so on, and then they became right again. But Berg essentially was not a spoiled child, but a child at the turn of the century, born in 1885. To be 20 or to be 18 or 19 at that period was to be in the middle of a cultural milieu, the like of which one can scarcely imagine. In terms of the quality of the concerts, the quality of the intellectual things, the work of Freud in Vienna, Mahler in charge of the opera house, Alfred Roller designing things. I mean, unbelievable productions. The twilight of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the First World War ruined it. Stefan Zweig living there, and so many poets, not only the Austrian poets, but the ones from like Hartleben, who's in this cycle, but also German poets, and of course Karl Hauptmann, and this poem is by Karl Hauptmann, was a Silesian, not a Viennese. But the fact that Alban Berg knew this poem at all is an indication of incredible cultural range. It's one of my favorite books. It's called Aus meinem Tagebuch, From My Diary, by Karl Hauptmann. And it was published in 1899. Here, by the way, is what Karl Hauptmann looked like as a poet. And here is his signature in terms of the dedication of this particular book that contains the poem that you have been working on. Towards the end, it has no title. There it is, Dämmern Wolken.
No title, interesting.
No title, so in fact, Die Nacht is Berg's title.
Oh.
And let me just say that the extraordinary thing about this particular book, and once you buy it and you read the poem for Die Nacht because Berg said it, you find other things about Karl Hauptmann. The fact that he was the most wonderful music critic, the fact that he was influenced by French literature, that what he writes about Bach and Beethoven and concerts that he attends is very inspiring. He was deeply musical. He was the older brother of a playwright and poet called Gerhard Hauptmann, a Nobel Prize winner, and essentially one of the great men of late 19th century, early 20th century literature. The only reason why we don't actually know very much about Gerhard Hauptmann is that music hasn't tended to be associated with him. We're very lucky that Goethe and Heine and Schiller and these great people, we have an access to them through music. But you know, there are certain extremely important figures who didn't happen to be set to music in terms of literature, and we've got to sort of fill in the gaps. And the Hauptmann brothers, I mean, Karl Hauptmann, who did the poem for Die Nacht, was the elder brother. He was also a playwright. He was, as I said, extremely musical. Once you get to do the whole cycle of the Sieben Frühe Lieder, you will come to what I think is the actual masterpiece in terms of music and poetry together, and that's called Traumgekrönt. And it's a poem of Rilke. And in this little set of books, which is the very first edition of any of the poems that Rilke actually set, and he calls it Traumgekrönt after one of the poems. This is such a book rarity, bibliophilic, because it's Rilke. But again, it's an indication of a marvelous, early developed sense of literature and taste, so much more interesting in terms of his literary affinities than Schoenberg, for example. And even Webern, who was very sensitive to words, doesn't have the wide range of Berg's feeling for words. I think it's as simple as that.